The morning started like any other Saturday in late September, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Maya Chen had woken up early, made herself a cup of coffee, and stepped out onto the small wooden deck she'd built with her own hands over the past 3 weekends. The deck overlooked what she privately called her sanctuary, a quarter-acre plot of land that sat at the edge of the Riverside Commons housing development. It wasn't much to look at yet, just cleared ground with stakes marking where she planned to build a small workshop and garden, but it was hers. Every square inch of it belonged to her, purchased fair and square 8 months ago from old Mr. Henderson, who'd owned the parcel for 40 years before deciding to retire to Florida. Maya had spent those 8 months doing everything by the book. She'd hired a surveyor, filed the deed with the county, paid her property taxes, and even had the land perimeter marked with proper boundary stakes and orange tape. She wasn't the type to cut corners or assume anything. Her father had been a civil engineer, and he drilled into her from a young age the importance of documentation, precision, and respecting property lines. Those lessons had served her well in her career as an architectural consultant, and they'd guided her through this land purchase too. She'd checked and double-checked everything, cross-referenced the legal description with county records, and even paid extra to have the survey company provide her with a detailed report showing exactly where her property began and where the HOA controlled common areas ended. There was no ambiguity, no gray area, no room for confusion. The land was hers. The Riverside Commons development sat adjacent to her property, a sprawling collection of cookie-cutter homes built about 15 years ago during the housing boom. The houses were nice enough, mostly two-story colonials and ranches painted in approved neutral tones, with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. The HOA governed everything from lawn height to paint colors to what type of holiday decorations residents could display. Maya had looked into buying one of those houses when she first moved to the area, but the restrictive covenants and monthly fees had turned her off. She preferred the freedom of owning her own land outright, even if it meant starting from scratch. Besides, her plot sat just outside the HOA boundaries, which meant she could build what she wanted, paint it whatever color pleased her, and never have to ask permission from a board of neighbors with too much time on their hands. She'd met a few of the Riverside Commons residents over the months since buying the land. Most of them were friendly enough, offering waves when they drove past or stopping to chat when they walked their dogs along the public road that separated the development from her property. A couple of them had even expressed interest in what she was planning to build, asking questions about her workshop design and whether she'd be selling any of the handcrafted furniture she mentioned making. But there was one resident who'd been different from the start, a woman named Patricia Whitmore who lived in one of the larger homes near the front of the development and who seemed to regard Maya's presence with barely concealed hostility. Patricia was the type of person who radiated authority even when she had none, the kind who spoke loudly in restaurants and expected service workers to jump at her commands. She'd introduced herself exactly once, about 6 months ago, by marching up to Maya's property line and demanding to know what Maya thought she was doing. Maya had politely explained that she'd purchased the land and was preparing to build a small workshop. Patricia had looked skeptical, her eyes narrowing behind designer sunglasses as she scanned the property with obvious disapproval. She'd muttered something about how the land looked terrible and how it would affect property values, then turned and left without another word. Maya had chalked it up to the territorial instinct some people had about their neighborhoods and hadn't thought much more about it. But Patricia hadn't forgotten. Over the following months, she'd driven past slowly several times a week, always staring at Maya's land with that same disapproving expression. Twice, Maya had caught her taking photos from her car. Once, Patricia had stopped and asked whether Maya had gotten proper permits, a question Maya had answered truthfully, that she didn't need permits yet because she hadn't started construction, but that she'd already checked with the county about requirements and would file everything necessary when the time came. Patricia had sniffed dismissively and driven away. The encounters left Maya unsettled, but not particularly worried. She'd dealt with difficult people before, and she knew that as long as she followed all the rules and kept her documentation in order, there was nothing anyone could do to prevent her from using her own property. That confidence was about to be tested in ways Maya couldn't have anticipated. As she stood on her deck that Saturday morning, coffee mug in hand, admiring the early morning light filtering through the trees at the back of her property, she heard the sound of car doors slamming. Multiple car doors. She turned to see 3 vehicles parked along the road, Patricia's silver SUV in the lead, flanked by a red sedan and a blue pickup truck. 6 people emerged from the cars, all of them looking toward Maya's property with expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Patricia stood at the front of the group, dressed in white capri pants and a striped blouse that probably cost more than Maya's entire week's grocery budget, pointing at Maya's land and speaking animatedly to the others. Maya felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't a friendly visit. She set down her coffee mug and walked down the deck steps, crossing the cleared ground toward the property line. As she approached, Patricia's voice became audible, sharp, and carrying easily across the morning air. She was telling the group about how this land had been part of the HOA common areas for years, how everyone in Riverside Commons had assumed it was part of their collective property, and how some stranger had shown up claiming to own it. The word squatter drifted across the space between them, making Maya's jaw clench. By the time Maya reached the orange boundary tape that marked her property line, the group had noticed her approach. Patricia stepped forward, her posture aggressive, one hand on her hip and the other clutching her phone like a weapon. The other 5 people hung back slightly, watching with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. Maya recognized 2 of them from previous brief encounters, Jeff and Linda Morrison from the corner house, but the others were strangers. She stopped at her property line and waited, refusing to be the first to speak or to cross onto the public road. This was her land, and she would hold her ground literally and figuratively. Patricia wasted no time launching into her attack. She announced loudly that Maya needed to leave immediately, that this land belonged to the Riverside Commons HOA, and that whatever Maya thought she knew was wrong. Her voice had that particular quality of someone used to being obeyed, each word delivered with absolute certainty and zero room for disagreement. She informed Maya that the HOA had maintained this land for years, that they'd mowed it and kept it clear, and that this established their right to it. Maya listened quietly, her mind already running through everything she knew about property law and adverse possession, calculating whether there was any possible way Patricia could be right. The answer was no. Adverse possession required continuous, open, notorious, exclusive, and hostile use of property for a statutory period that varied by state, but was typically between 10 and 20 years. The land had been owned by Mr. Henderson until 8 months ago, and he'd paid taxes on it continuously. The fact that the HOA had occasionally mowed it, probably because it sat next to their development and they wanted it to look neat, gave them exactly zero legal claim to ownership. But Meyer also knew that explaining legal concepts to someone like Patricia in the middle of an ambush was unlikely to be productive. She needed to stay calm, stick to facts, and not let herself be provoked into an emotional response. Meyer responded in a level voice that she owned the land, that she had a recorded deed and survey, and that there was no confusion about the boundaries. She offered to show Patricia the documentation if that would help clear things up. The offer was ignored completely. Patricia talked over her, raising her voice even louder to declare that Maya was trespassing, that the police would be called if she didn't leave immediately, and that the HOA attorney would be contacting her about this illegal occupation. The other 5 people shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure about what they'd been brought here to witness. Linda Morrison whispered something to her husband Jeff, who shrugged and looked away. Things escalated quickly from there. Patricia pulled out her phone and began recording video, announcing for the camera that she was documenting an illegal squatter on HOA property. She demanded Maya's name, address, and phone number, insisting it was her right as an HOA board member to collect this information. Maya refused politely but firmly, stating that she didn't owe Patricia any personal information, and that if Patricia wanted to pursue any legal action, she could do so through proper channels. This refusal seemed to infuriate Patricia even more. Her face flushed red, and her voice climbed higher as she informed Maya that refusing to cooperate was proof of wrongdoing, that only someone with something to hide would refuse to provide basic information. The confrontation drew attention from other Riverside Commons residents. 2 more cars slowed down, their occupants craning their necks to see what was happening. A woman walking her golden retriever stopped on the sidewalk across the street, phone out, clearly filming the scene. Maya noticed all of this peripherally while keeping her focus on Patricia, who had now stepped closer to the boundary line, close enough that Maya could smell her expensive perfume. Patricia was still recording, her phone held up between them like a shield and a weapon simultaneously, narrating for her video about the squatter who'd illegally taken over HOA land and was now refusing to identify herself. Maya made a decision. She pulled out her own phone and opened the document folder where she kept digital copies of all her property records. She pulled up the survey map, zoomed in so the boundary lines were clearly visible, and held it out toward Patricia. She explained calmly that this was a certified survey showing the exact boundaries of her property, that it had been filed with the county, and that it clearly showed this land was outside the HOA boundaries. Patricia barely glanced at the phone screen before dismissing it with a wave of her hand. She declared that anyone could fake documents, that she'd seen the HOA maps and knew for a fact this land was part of their common areas, and that Maya's little phone pictures didn't change reality. The absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. Maya was standing on her own property, purchased legally and documented properly, being accused of being a criminal by someone who had no authority over her and no legitimate claim to the land. The other people Patricia had brought along as her audience were looking increasingly uncomfortable, particularly the Morrisons, who'd started edging back toward their car. But Patricia seemed energized by her own anger, feeding off it, her voice getting louder and her gestures more dramatic. She announced that she was calling the police right now, that Maya would be arrested for trespassing, and that she'd better enjoy her last few minutes on this land before she was hauled away in handcuffs. Maya remained quiet as Patricia made the call, speaking to the police dispatcher in that same authoritative tone she used for everything, reporting a trespasser on HOA property who was refusing to leave. Maya heard her give the address, describe the situation in wildly inaccurate terms, and request immediate assistance. When Patricia ended the call, she looked triumphant, announcing loudly to her assembled witnesses that the police were on their way and would sort this out. The implied threat was clear. Patricia expected Maya to be the one in trouble when law enforcement arrived, but Maya wasn't worried about the police. She had complete documentation of her ownership, and she knew that property disputes were civil matters that police typically refused to get involved in unless there was a criminal element like breaking and entering or vandalism. An officer would show up, probably assess the situation quickly, tell both parties this was a civil issue, and advise them to work it out through their attorneys or the courts. The real problem wasn't the police. It was the fact that Patricia had now escalated things publicly, recruited witnesses, and made accusations that could potentially damage Maya's reputation in the community before the truth came out. While they waited for the police to arrive, more residents gathered. Some stayed in their cars, slowing down to watch before driving on. Others parked and got out, drawn by the commotion and the sight of Patricia, who many of them recognized as one of the more vocal HOA board members, in the middle of what appeared to be a serious confrontation. The woman with the golden retriever had called over 2 friends who'd been jogging past, and all 3 of them stood on the far sidewalk, phones out, capturing everything. Maya wondered what the video footage would look like later, whether it would be clear who was the aggressor and who was calmly defending their own property, or whether the editing and commentary would twist things into something unrecognizable. Patricia used the waiting time to continue building her case to her audience. She explained loudly about property values and neighborhood standards, about how the HOA worked hard to maintain the quality of the area, and about how people who tried to take advantage of hardworking homeowners needed to be stopped. She painted a picture of Meyer as an opportunist who'd seen a piece of land and decided to claim it without any legal right, gambling that the HOA wouldn't notice or wouldn't care enough to fight back. The narrative was compelling in its simplicity, and Maya could see a few of the onlookers nodding along, already convinced by Patricia's confidence and apparent authority. Maya considered speaking up, explaining the situation to the growing crowd, but she held back. Anything she said now would just be her word against Patricia's, and Patricia clearly had the advantage of being a known quantity in this community. Better to wait for the police, provide them with documentation, and let the official record speak for itself. Besides, Maya had learned from past experiences that trying to argue with someone who was already committed to a narrative rarely changed any minds. People believed what they wanted to believe, especially when the person doing the talking spoke with absolute certainty. The police cruiser arrived about 15 minutes after Patricia's call, pulling up slowly and parking behind Patricia's SUV. A single officer emerged, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and the kind of tired expression that suggested he'd seen every kind of ridiculous dispute in his years on the force. He approached the group with his hands relaxed at his sides, his body language deliberately non-threatening, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. His eyes swept over Patricia's assembled witnesses, lingered on the phones recording the encounter, and finally settled on Patricia herself, who immediately launched into her explanation without waiting for him to ask. The officer let her talk for about 30 seconds before holding up a hand to stop her. He asked a simple question: who owned the land they were standing near? Patricia immediately insisted the HOA did, that it was part of their common areas, and that Maya was trespassing. The officer turned to Maya, who was still standing calmly on her side of the boundary line, and asked the same question. Maya responded that she owned it, that she had documentation, and that she'd be happy to provide whatever proof he needed. The officer nodded slowly, already understanding where this was going. He asked both women to produce documentation of ownership. Patricia fumbled with her phone, clearly not having anticipated this request, insisting that she didn't carry HOA maps with her, but that they were on file with the management company and could be retrieved. The officer waited patiently while Patricia made increasingly flustered excuses about how the documents existed but weren't immediately available. Meanwhile, Maya pulled up her digital files and showed the officer her recorded deed, the survey map with certification stamps, and the property tax records showing her as the current owner. The officer studied each document carefully, zooming in on the legal descriptions and boundary markers, comparing them to the physical location where they stood. The change in atmosphere was immediate and obvious. Patricia's confidence wavered as she watched the officer nod at Maya's documents and take notes. The assembled witnesses began to murmur among themselves, sensing a shift in the dynamic. The Morrisons had already reached their car and were getting in, clearly wanting no part of where this was heading. Patricia tried to regain control of the narrative, insisting that the documents must be fake or that the survey was wrong, but her voice had lost its commanding certainty. She sounded desperate now, grasping at increasingly implausible explanations for why Maya's thorough documentation shouldn't be trusted. The officer turned to face Patricia fully and explained in a calm but firm voice that property ownership disputes were civil matters, that he had no authority to remove someone from land they appeared to legally own, and that if the HOA believed they had a claim to the property, they would need to pursue it through the courts. He added that making false reports to police could itself be a criminal matter, and that everyone involved should be very certain of their facts before making accusations. The warning was clear, and Patricia's face went from red to pale in the span of seconds. She started to argue, but the officer cut her off, suggesting that she contact her HOA attorney and handle this through proper legal channels. Then the officer did something that would prove crucial in everything that followed. He turned back to Maya and asked whether she wanted to press charges for harassment or filing a false police report. Maya hesitated, genuinely uncertain. Part of her wanted Patricia to face some consequence for this public ambush and the accusations she'd made. But another part recognized that pressing charges would only escalate an already tense situation and might make living near this community even more difficult in the future. She told the officer she'd prefer to just have the situation documented in his report for now, but reserved the right to pursue action later if the harassment continued. The officer nodded and spent several minutes writing up his report, asking Maya for her contact information and making notes about the documents she'd shown him. He photographed her survey map and deed on his phone for his records. Meanwhile, Patricia stood frozen, her earlier bravado completely deflated, as the reality of the situation became clear to everyone watching. The woman who'd been so certain of her authority, so confident in her accusations, had been proven wrong in front of a growing crowd of witnesses and multiple cameras. The video footage spreading across social media and neighborhood forums wasn't going to show a brave HOA board member confronting a squatter. It was going to show an aggressive woman harassing a legitimate property owner and making false accusations to police. As the officer finished his report and prepared to leave, he offered one final piece of advice, directing it at Patricia specifically, but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. He suggested that in the future, before accusing someone of trespassing or illegal activity, it might be wise to actually verify the facts first. Property records were public information available at the county assessor's office, and a simple search would have prevented this entire situation. His tone made clear what he thought about people who wasted police resources on disputes they hadn't bothered to research. Patricia said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line, her phone now hanging limply at her side, the recording stopped and forgotten. The officer left, and the crowd began to disperse slowly. People returning to their cars or continuing their walks, already pulling out phones to share what they just witnessed. Patricia remained standing by her SUV for a long moment, staring at Maya with an expression that mixed humiliation, anger, and something else that might have been fear. She'd gambled on public confrontation as a strategy to intimidate Maya into backing down, and she'd lost spectacularly. More than that, she'd done so in front of witnesses and cameras, creating a permanent record of her defeat. But as Patricia finally got into her SUV and drove away without another word, Maya felt a knot forming in her stomach. She'd won this confrontation, but she had a sinking feeling that Patricia wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The humiliation Patricia had just experienced in front of her neighbors and fellow HOA members wouldn't make her back down. If anything, it would make her more determined to prove she'd been right all along, to find some way to challenge Maya's ownership, to salvage her wounded pride. Maya had dealt with people like Patricia before, people who doubled down when confronted with evidence they were wrong, who became more entrenched in their positions rather than admitting error. Maya walked back to her deck, picked up her now cold coffee, and looked out over her land. The peaceful morning she'd anticipated was thoroughly ruined, replaced by the adrenaline crash that followed confrontation and the worry about what would come next. She'd bought this land to escape exactly this kind of drama, to have a quiet place where she could build something with her own hands without interference from neighbors or homeowners associations or people who thought their opinions should govern everyone around them. And now, through no fault of her own except purchasing property that happened to sit next to an HOA, she was at the center of a dispute that would likely get worse before it got better. She spent the rest of the day documenting everything that had happened, writing down a detailed timeline while the events were fresh in her memory, and making backup copies of all her property records. She pulled out the entire file folder from her property purchase, reviewing every document Mr. Henderson had given her, every piece of correspondence with the title company, every receipt and stamp and signature. She wanted to be prepared for whatever came next, whether that was a lawsuit, more harassment, or some other escalation she couldn't yet anticipate. Her father had always said that preparation was the best defense against chaos, and she'd taken that lesson to heart. As evening fell and the autumn light faded to darkness, Maya stood on her deck one more time, looking toward the Riverside Commons development. Lights glowed in the windows of dozens of homes, families settling in for their Saturday nights, most of them probably unaware of what had happened that morning or already forgetting about it as they moved on with their lives. But somewhere in one of those houses, Patricia was probably seething, plotting her next move, convincing herself that she'd been right and that Maya had somehow tricked everyone. And somewhere else, probably in multiple houses, neighbors were sharing videos of the confrontation, adding their own commentary, spreading the story through social media and group chats. The story was just beginning, Maya realized. This morning's confrontation was just the opening chapter in what would become a much longer saga, one that would test her patience, her resources, and her commitment to the land she'd worked so hard to purchase legally and properly. She'd thought buying property outside HOA boundaries would give her freedom from exactly this kind of interference. Instead, it had made her a target for someone who couldn't stand the idea of not having control over every piece of land they could see from their development. Maya went inside, locked her doors, and tried to relax for the rest of the evening. But sleep came slowly that night, and when it finally arrived, it was troubled by dreams of boundary lines and orange tape and pointing fingers. She didn't know it yet, but the confrontation that morning would set off a chain of events that would expose far more than just Patricia's ignorance about property boundaries. It would reveal the deeper corruption and incompetence within the HOA, drag multiple lawyers and county officials into the dispute, and ultimately force questions about authority, documentation, and truth that no one had been asking before Patricia decided to call Meyer a squatter on land that had never belonged to the HOA at all. The video went viral by Sunday afternoon, spreading far beyond the Riverside Commons community and into the wider world of HOA horror stories and property rights discussions that thrived in certain corners of the internet. Maya discovered this when her phone started buzzing with notifications from people she barely knew. Friends of friends who'd seen the footage and recognized her, supportive messages from complete strangers who'd watched Patricia's meltdown and wanted to offer encouragement. The video had been edited and re-uploaded by multiple accounts, some with commentary tracks analyzing every moment of the confrontation, others with dramatic music and text overlays highlighting the key exchanges. The consensus across platforms was overwhelmingly in Maya's favor, with thousands of comments mocking Patricia's confidence and praising Maya's calm demeanor under pressure. Maya felt conflicted about the attention. On one hand, the public support was validating, confirmation that she'd handled the situation correctly, and that most reasonable people could see through Patricia's baseless accusations. On the other hand, she hadn't wanted to become an internet personality or the face of some movement against HOA overreach. She was a private person who valued her anonymity, and now her face and her property dispute were being shared across multiple platforms by people with agendas she didn't necessarily agree with. Some of the commentary veered into territory that made her uncomfortable, calling for Patricia to be doxxed or harassed, suggesting violent responses to HOA tyranny, twisting the incident into political narratives about property rights and government overreach that had nothing to do with what had actually happened. She spent Sunday trying to ignore the growing online storm, focusing instead on practical preparations for what she knew would come next. Patricia wasn't going to let this go, and the viral humiliation would only intensify whatever response the HOA planned to mount. Maya contacted her real estate attorney, the same one who'd handled her property purchase, and scheduled an appointment for Monday morning. She wanted professional legal advice about how to protect herself from whatever escalation was coming, whether that meant restraining orders, defamation suits, or preparation for a property dispute lawsuit. The attorney, a sharp woman in her 50s named Rachel Kim, had seemed unsurprised by Maya's call and had immediately cleared time in her schedule, suggesting she'd already seen or heard about the confrontation. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected development. Maya woke to find a certified letter wedged into her door frame, official enough to require signature but delivered in a way that suggested someone had delivered it rather than going through proper postal service channels. The envelope bore the return address of Riverside Commons HOA and the name of a law firm Maya didn't recognize. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, already knowing this wouldn't be good news, but unprepared for just how aggressive the contents would prove to be. The letter was a cease and desist notice, 3 pages of dense legal language that boiled down to a demand that Meyer immediately stop trespassing on HOA property, remove all structures and markers she'd placed on the land, and vacate the premises within 72 hours. The letter claimed that the land in question had been incorporated into the HOA common areas through a boundary agreement executed 15 years ago when the development was built, that Maya's purchase from Mr. Henderson was invalid because he'd had no right to sell land he no longer owned, and that continued occupation would result in legal action seeking injunctive relief, damages, and attorney's fees. The tone was threatening and absolute, written with the kind of certainty that assumed Maya would simply comply rather than fight back. Maya read through the letter 3 times, her initial shock giving way to cold anger. Every claim in the document was provably false. There had been no boundary agreement. The county records showed clear title passing from Mr. Henderson to Maya, and the property tax assessments had been continuous and correct throughout. But the letter's existence revealed something important about the HOA strategy. They weren't interested in truth or documentation. They were trying to intimidate her with legal threats, gambling that she'd either back down or at least be forced to spend significant money on attorneys to defend against baseless claims. It was a bullying tactic wrapped in official language, counting on her to be overwhelmed by the apparent authority of legal letterhead and firm language. She photographed every page of the letter, saved digital copies to multiple locations, and added it to her growing file of documentation. Then she grabbed her keys and headed to her attorney's office, arriving 15 minutes early for her appointment and using the time to review her notes and calm her nerves. Rachel Kim's office was located in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel and minimalist design, the kind of place that suggested competence and success. Maya had worked with Rachel before and trusted her judgment completely. If anyone could navigate this escalating situation, it would be her. Rachel greeted Maya with the same calm professionalism she always displayed, gesturing her into a comfortable conference room with a view of the city skyline. She'd already printed out several frames from the viral video, along with what appeared to be county property records and legal documents Maya didn't recognize. Before Maya could even show her the cease and desist letter, Rachel was pulling out her own copy, explaining that the law firm representing the HOA had sent her office a courtesy copy that morning. The fact that they'd done so suggested they knew Maya had legal representation, which meant they'd done at least minimal research into her background before firing off their threats. Rachel's assessment of the cease and desist letter was blunt and reassuring. She described it as a poorly researched intimidation tactic that wouldn't survive even cursory scrutiny in court. The claims about a boundary agreement were particularly amateurish because such agreements had to be recorded with the county to be valid, and a quick search of public records showed no such document existed. Rachel had already done that search before Maya arrived, pulling up the complete chain of title for Maya's property going back 50 years. The land had been privately owned continuously, with clear documentation at every transfer. Mr. Henderson had owned it free and clear. He'd sold it to Maya legitimately, and there was no point in the chain where the HOA had acquired any rights or interest in the property. But Rachel's expression grew more serious as she explained what the letter really represented. This wasn't just a property dispute between neighbors. This was an HOA board, possibly the entire board or just Patricia acting with board authority, making false claims to property they didn't own and threatening legal action based on those false claims. That meant potential liability for the board members personally, especially if they'd made these claims knowing they were false, or with reckless disregard for the truth. Rachel suggested that someone on that board should have checked the property records before sending such a letter, and the fact that they apparently hadn't suggested either incompetence or willful blindness to facts that contradicted their desired narrative. Rachel proposed a two-part strategy. First, she would draft a response to the cease and desist letter that firmly rebutted every claim with supporting documentation, making clear that Maya had no intention of complying with baseless demands and that any lawsuit filed on these grounds would be defended vigorously. Second, she would file a public records request with the county for any and all documents related to the supposed boundary agreement the HOA claimed existed, as well as any correspondence between the HOA and county officials regarding Maya's property. The records request would serve two purposes. It would create an official paper trail of Maya's efforts to verify the truth, and it would potentially uncover whether county officials had been involved in or aware of the HOA false claims. Maya agreed to both approaches immediately, relieved to have clear next steps and professional support. Rachel estimated the response letter would be ready by Wednesday, giving her time to thoroughly research every aspect of the HOA claims and craft language that would make clear the weakness of their position. She also suggested that Maya document everything going forward, every interaction with HOA board members or residents, every piece of mail or communication, every visit to her property or change in the situation. If this escalated to actual litigation, as Rachel suspected it would, that documentation would be crucial. As Maya left Rachel's office, she felt a mixture of confidence and dread. Confidence because she had the truth, the documentation, and skilled legal representation on her side. Dread because she knew from experience that having the law on your side didn't always prevent people from making your life difficult. Patricia and the HOA board could drag this out for months or years, filing motion after motion, appealing every ruling, using the legal system as a weapon of harassment, even if they had no real chance of winning. The process itself would be the punishment, forcing Maya to spend time, money, and emotional energy defending rights that should have been beyond question. She drove back to her property, noticing as she approached that something was different. A large sign had been erected on the public road right of way adjacent to her land, professionally printed on weatherproof material and mounted on metal posts. The sign read, "Notice, this property is subject to an ongoing legal dispute. The Riverside Commons HOA claims ownership rights. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Below that was the HOA contact information and a reference to county ordinance numbers that Maya suspected were either irrelevant or didn't actually say what the sign implied they said. Maya parked and walked over to examine the sign more closely. It had been installed recently, probably sometime that morning while she'd been at Rachel's office. The posts were sunk into concrete, suggesting this wasn't a temporary measure. The sign's placement was calculated, visible to anyone approaching her property from the main road, designed to warn off potential contractors or visitors and to publicly cast doubt on her ownership. It was another intimidation tactic, an attempt to make her look like a disputed occupant rather than a legitimate owner, and it was potentially illegal depending on whose property the sign was actually on and what the public right of way rules were. She took detailed photographs of the sign from multiple angles, including close-ups that showed the installation date stamp on the back of the sign, visible where the installers had left the manufacturer's sticker. Then she called Rachel again and described what she'd found. Rachel's response was immediate and angry in a way that suggested professional outrage at the HOA tactics. She instructed Maya not to touch or remove the sign herself, as that could potentially expose her to claims of vandalism or interference with HOA property, even though the sign itself was probably illegally placed. Instead, Rachel would handle it through official channels, filing a complaint with the county about unauthorized signage in the public right-of-way and demanding its immediate removal. Tuesday brought another development, this time from an unexpected source. Maya received a call from a number she didn't recognize, and when she answered, a man's voice identified himself as Dennis Crawford, a member of the Riverside Commons HOA board. His tone was apologetic and conciliatory, completely different from Patricia's aggressive approach. He explained that he'd only recently learned about the confrontation and the cease and desist letter, that he'd been out of town for the past week, and had returned to find the situation spiraling out of control. He wanted to meet with Meyer in person, just the two of them, to discuss the situation and see if there was a way to resolve things without further escalation. Maya was immediately suspicious. The timing seemed too convenient, coming right after her attorney meeting and the sign installation. This could be a genuine olive branch from a board member who recognized how badly Patricia had handled things, or it could be another tactic, an attempt to get Maya to say something compromising or to make concessions that could later be used against her. She told Dennis she'd need to think about it and consult with her attorney before agreeing to any meeting. She also asked him directly about the sign that had been erected on public property. His response was telling, a long pause followed by careful words about how he hadn't been aware of that particular action and would look into it. After ending the call, Meyer immediately contacted Rachel again and described the conversation. Rachel's advice was cautious but not entirely negative. A meeting could potentially be useful if handled correctly, but only under specific conditions. It would need to happen in a neutral location. Rachel would need to be present, and anything discussed would need to be documented in writing afterward. If Dennis was genuinely interested in resolving the dispute, he'd agree to those terms. If he was looking for an informal conversation where Maya might make admissions or concessions, he'd balk at the formality. Rachel offered to reach out to Dennis directly to propose the meeting terms and see how he responded. Wednesday morning brought news of the sign's removal. Maya discovered this when she drove to her property and found the posts cut at ground level, the sign itself gone, and orange spray paint marks on the road surface, indicating County Public Works had been there. A notice was taped to one of her property boundary stakes, explaining that unauthorized signage had been removed from the public right-of way per county ordinance, and that the responsible party would be billed for removal costs. Maya felt a small surge of satisfaction at this minor victory, though she knew it would probably just anger Patricia and the HOA board further. Rachel's formal response letter to the cease and desist was delivered that same afternoon, sent via certified mail with return receipt, requested to both the HOA law firm and the HOA board directly. Maya received a copy and read through it.